Module 14, Energy Requirements and Dietary Planning. So why should an athlete be concerned about energy requirements? Well, we know that if an athlete is not consuming sufficient amount of calories or energy, that actually will lead to decreases in the effort of training. So their training intensity won't be as great. We also know that muscle and fat will be used for energy preferentially, so that could work against the athlete, and that possibly the intake of essential nutrients might be inadequate. In the long term, perhaps health might also be compromised. So energy is very, very important for the athlete as far as their training and well-being and their performance. What is energy balance? Energy balance is all about energy in versus the amount of energy out. So what we're talking about here is metabolizable energy. So that's going to exclude any energy that's lost in the feces or urine. So we're only talking about metabolizable energy here. For most people, about 90 to 95% of energy intake is going to be metabolized. So that's pretty good. We're really efficient at utilizing all of the potential energy in our macronutrients for ATP production. As far as tipping the balance of energy in either direction, if we have a positive energy balance, that means that we are consuming more energy in versus what we are expending. So energy in is going to be greater than energy out. That means that I could potentially gain body mass, and more likely it's going to be in the form of fat mass. As far as negative energy balance, our energy intake will be less than our energy expenditure. So in this scenario, we might expect to see a loss of body mass. And again, this could be fat mass or in some cases even muscle mass loss. Then we can get into the issue of what's called macronutrient balance. And this is just looking at the oxidative rates of each of the macronutrients. So how much is oxidized versus how much is taken in. So in this instance, we're talking about carbohydrates here. So carbohydrate intake, when macronutrient or carbohydrate balance is achieved, we have carbohydrate intake equaling carbohydrate oxidation. So when we ingest carbohydrates, that's going to stimulate glycogen storage as well as glucose oxidation and will actually inhibit fat oxidation. So when we have carbohydrate available, we're going to use carbohydrate for energy. Any excess glucose that is consumed, as well as protein, can actually be turned into triglyceride. But however, this is not something that we normally like to do. So what we like to do is oxidize or burn the available carbohydrates and utilize them for ATP production. So in this instance, for carbohydrate, we're oxidizing the carbohydrate first before it actually gets stored as triglyceride. It's actually kind of an expensive process. It does cost ATP in order to turn glucose into triglyceride. So in order to get that happen, you really have to work at it. Of course, it's easier to do excess caloric intake than it is for exercise, but it does take a little bit of work nonetheless. So we've got consecutive days of excessive carbohydrate intake, and that's a key, and positive energy balance is going to promote triglyceride storage. So in other words, if we have an excess of carbohydrate consumption, as well as a positive energy balance, then we're going to take some of that excess glucose and convert it into triglyceride for storage in later use. So basically we're performing de novo lipogenesis, where we get triglyceride synthesized and that triglyceride is packed away in adipose tissue. With protein balance, we're looking at protein intake versus protein oxidation. So once our protein needs are met, then we can deaminate the protein or amino acids, take off that amine group, and we're left with the carbon skeleton that can then be used for energy, so for oxidation, ATP production. This, however, is highly dependent upon the total energy intake as well as the carbohydrate intake. With inadequacies, we actually can get a negative protein balance and use more of the carbon skeletons for ATP production. Whereas with adequacy, we're going to spare that protein and use it for our protein needs, our nitrogen needs, and waste less of the protein because we've got plenty of energy around and carbohydrate availability. So with adequacy, you do expand the amino acid pool, which establishes a new balance point. We can contribute indirectly to triglyceride storage, not by taking the carbon skeletons and producing triglyceride, although that can happen, but we're actually diverting any dietary fat that we've consumed to adipose tissue. It's much easier, if you think about this from a physiological standpoint, it's much easier to take triglyceride that's already in the form of triglyceride and simply move it into adipose tissue rather than taking these carbon skeletons and then having to put them together and add and move atoms and whatnot all around the molecule to turn it into triglyceride. So it's much easier to just divert that dietary fat over to adipose tissue. As far as fat intake and fat oxidation are concerned, in the short term, you see very little when we consume more fat, very little increases in dietary fat or little change in fat oxidation. So we're basically just going to promote fatty acid storage as triglycerides so that additional fat that we've consumed will basically be put away as fat in triglyceride. So if energy expenditure and protein are held constant, then we actually get an inverse relationship between carbohydrate and fat oxidation. So as an example, if we increase our carbohydrate intake, then our fat oxidation is going to decrease, which means then that fat is going to be put away in triglyceride for later use. So if you think about how these macronutrients kind of work off each other, when we have plenty of carbohydrate and plenty of protein around, we're going to utilize those for ATP production, particularly carbohydrates, and fat just simply gets put away in adipose tissue and stored for later use, simply because it's already existing in the form that it needs to be in order to be in adipose tissue. Now in the long term, we change things a little bit here. We get a positive fat balance that then will cause an increase in triglyceride deposition. So what we're trying to do here is actually establish a new energy balance for fat. So we're taking that triglyceride, putting it away for later use, and that's causing an increase in overall mass that we have on our body. So we're promoting body fat stores, and we're actually going to reduce the amount of fat oxidation. We will, however, though, increase the amount of circulating free fatty acids. So the idea there is that we'll have a little bit more fatty acids available for fat oxidation. So balance is going to be achieved when oxidative rates are actually matched with intake at a significantly higher body mass. So we'll reestablish balance after we've overconsumed fat in the long term once we've put on a significant amount of body mass. So we put on this new higher body mass. That means now in order to support that new higher body mass, we have to have a higher intake of fat to support that particular body mass. So you've reestablished a new balance among all of the macronutrients. As far as ethanol intake or alcohol consumption, again, ethanol intake equaling ethanol oxidation. When we ingest alcohol, we have to get rid of it. It's a toxic substance to us, so we rapidly increase the oxidation of the ethanol until it is completely removed from the body. In general, we can metabolize 1 drink per hour. So it becomes, during that consumption of the beverage, the preferred substrate to make ATP. What ends up happening as a result of that is that we actually suppress fat oxidation, which is going to shift that fat back into triglyceride storage away from any other usage. So particularly in the liver, we shut down liver fat oxidation, which is one of the reasons why that when we do have some alcohol, particularly when we consume more beverages than moderation, we actually can get fatty liver. And if you continue to get fatty liver, that eventually then could lead to liver cirrhosis. So we don't store ethanol in triglyceride and adipose tissue. We basically oxidize it first, and in the meantime, we're shifting any dietary fat that we've gotten into triglyceride, and we're suppressing fatty acid oxidation. Now, it doesn't contribute to the formation of muscle or liver glycogen as well. That's also an important point to come away with. How does macronutrient distribution affect body mass and body composition? We are eating mixed meals, so how does separating all of these macronutrients out into their individual balances overall affect body composition and body mass? Well, it turns out that macronutrient composition really isn't all that important when it comes to body mass. In fact, if you don't have an energy imbalance, you really won't see a difference in body composition. So in other words, as long as the athlete is consuming the correct number of calories every single day to support their current weight, it really doesn't matter the macronutrient composition. The body's going to adjust as far as the balances of the individual macronutrients and increase oxidation of one and decrease oxidation of another without actually affecting overall body mass. So under normal physiological conditions, carbohydrate, protein, and alcohol are not easily converted to body fat. So just because an athlete consumes more fat or they're consuming more alcohol, unless you're in that positive energy balance, leaning towards the intake side of things, then you're not going to see a change in body composition, at least according to some of the literature. Some other factors do play a role, however. So the physiological makeup of the person, the genetic makeup, can't stress enough the bioindividuality of each person, the environment that the person is in, the lifestyle that they're engaged in, and of course behaviors. All of these are factors that we need to be cognizant of when we're helping the athlete maintain their energy intake and maintaining their body composition. What's the significance behind energy and macronutrient balance? Well, we know that this is a dynamic process. That is, it's constantly in flux. We can adjust very rapidly to the intake of whatever macronutrients we're consuming. It's also very time dependent, so this can change from day to day, and we will readjust the macronutrient balance. And this allows for changing energy stores on energy expenditure over time. So we can manipulate how we store nutrients and the energy availability and the type of energy that we have in order to make ATP. So it's very, very important that we have this flexibility because it allows us to adapt to changing circumstances. So as an example of this, this is a classic example that is used quite often in textbooks, but let's say that someone decided to consume 100 extra kilocalories per day over the course of 40 years. That would lead to an excess of 1.5 million kilocalories. So if you assume that 7,700 kilocalories per kilogram of body fat, that is going to lead to a weight gain of 190 kilograms in body mass. Now, in reality, we know that this doesn't actually happen and that we only get about an increase of 2.7 kilograms of body mass as fat mass. Now, why does this happen? It's because we reestablish a new energy balance. So we eat an extra 100 calories a day, that's going to be equivalent to a certain amount of fat mass that we add. And if we add weight to the human body, then we're actually going to establish a new energy balance. So in other words, if an individual weighs 70 kilograms and they suddenly now packed on additional calories and they're weighing at 75 kilograms, it actually takes more energy to maintain that 75 kilograms of body mass versus the 70 kilograms of body mass. So any additional kilocalories that are being consumed are going to maintaining that new weight. So you wouldn't necessarily gain this huge amount of body mass that is seen in this example here. What are the components of energy expenditure? There are lots of different ways that we expend calories. The first of which, and probably represents the greatest amount of where energy is going to, is what we call basal metabolic rate. When you talk about metabolism, this is what people are referring to. It's also known as basal energy expenditure, or BEE for short. It's often interchangeably used with what's called resting metabolic rate, and I'll talk a little bit about resting metabolic rate in the next slide or two here. The energy required to sustain body systems and temperature at rest is what we're talking about here. So just to sustain life, just to be alive, this is what BMR is all about. So about 60 to 80% of the energy expenditure in healthy sedentary adults is going to the BMR. So when we're talking about elite athletes, that represents less than 20 to 47% of energy expenditure in elite athletes, simply because what they're doing physically is much more in their training. So that percentage actually drops a little bit. But for most people, the basal metabolic rate represents the greatest energy expenditure that they're going to have throughout a given day. So what is BMR affected by? Well, it's affected by age. The older we get, the less BMR, the lower that value tends to be. It's affected by gender and body size. The more muscle mass you have, the higher the metabolic rate, as well as the size of the fat-free mass and fat mass. 80% of the variability in BMR can be accounted for by just age, gender, and fat-free mass. It's going to decline by about 1 to 2% per decade of life, any from the decades of 20 to 70-year-old individuals. And this is mainly due to a decrease in fat-free mass. So as we grow older, if we do nothing to maintain the muscle mass that we have, then we'll slowly lose muscle mass. And of course, we slowly lose muscle mass, then we're going to lose the metabolic activity, which is going to lower our basal metabolic rate. Now, there's some recent evidence that suggests that perhaps brain weight may actually be a more important factor in BMR as well, since the brain tissue is far more active than muscle tissue. The menstrual cycle also has an effect on BMR. It seems that the follicular phase has a much lower basal metabolic rate than during the luteal phase. The difference in phases represents about 100 to 300 kilocalorie difference, depending upon the individuals. So it seems that energy intake patterns do match the fluctuations. So you'll see changes in the way that women have as far as their dietary patterns are concerned that match this change in kilocalorie expenditure. One of the more popular areas that's been looked at recently is something called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. Down here at the bottom of the screen is the classic curve that you'll see in textbooks and in the literature that show EPOC. And EPOC is basically this section here, the last portion of each of these graphs. And basically what it's saying is that if I'm consuming more oxygen towards the end of my exercise, then that means I'm more metabolically active. So I have elevated metabolic rate. So if I do exercise, my metabolism is increased for minutes or hours after exercise. And we know that this does happen. So it is dependent upon exercise intensity and or duration. It actually has to be high in order to have a significant impact. So if you're just doing 30 to 60 minutes at 50 to 65% of VO2 max, it doesn't seem to change EPOC very much. So you really do have to do high intensity work. And that kind of fits nicely with some of the more recent literature that suggests high intensity interval training may be a better way to go as far as burning off calories and getting fitter quicker, as well as perhaps some of the health benefits associated with that kind of training. So within about an hour, oxygen levels, as far as oxygen consumption are concerned, do seem to return to normal. So this all spells an increase in metabolism. We also have the thermic effect of food contributing to energy expenditure. It's also known as the specific dynamic action of food, or the diet-induced thermogenesis, or DIT. So there are several different names for the same phenomenon. And basically this represents the increase in energy expenditure above RMR from the total consumption of food throughout the day. So basically this is the cost of digesting, absorbing, transporting, running metabolism, and storing nutrients. So this is the energy cost of basically processing any food that we consume. So the thermic effect of a meal, which is another way to look at things, actually just represents the increase in metabolic rate above RMR after the ingestion of a single meal. So thermic effect of a meal is just looking at an isolated meal, whereas the thermic effect of food is looking at the daily energy expenditure in processing all the food that we've consumed during that day. It represents about 6 to 10% of our total energy expenditure. In women, that does seem to be just a little bit different, 6 to 7%, and it's dependent upon how energy dense the food is, the type of food that's eaten, so the macronutrient distribution, the amount of fiber that's in the diet. As far as the diet composition is concerned, it's assuming that the diet is about 5 to 10% carbohydrate and 3 to 5% fat, as well as protein anywhere from 20 to 30%. The degree of obesity also makes a difference as well. The next component of energy expenditure, so thus far we've talked about BMR and the thermic effect of food, and the next one that's significant is the energy expended in physical activity. So we can look at several components here. We have the thermic effect of activity, or the TEA. So this is then broken down into planned physical activity. So if you plan to go out for a walk today, that's part of the thermic effect of activity. And we also have non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. This includes purposeful activities like dressing, shopping, cooking, gardening, going to the refrigerator to get yourself a snack. Those would all be considered components of NEAT. There is some recent research that suggests this may now play a significant role in energy balance. So looking at NEAT is something that you'll find in the literature quite a bit, and trying to associate that with a significance as far as the impact in everyday life and the amount of weight gain that people might experience. We also have spontaneous physical activity, or SPA. This is going to include things like shivering and adjusting to the temperature, fidgeting, twitches. All of those would be considered SPA, or spontaneous physical activity. All of these represent the energy cost of activities above resting metabolic rate. In some individuals, it's only going to account for 10 to 15% of energy expenditure in sedentary people, and it can be as high as 50% in active individuals. So this is pretty significant as far as energy expenditure is concerned, particularly for the athlete. We also have adaptive thermogenesis, and basically this is a temporary increase in thermogenesis. So we do respond with an increase in energy expenditure to cold, to heat, to altitude, if we're scared, if we're stressed out, if we're on medications or consuming drugs. All of these things are going to affect our metabolic rate. So what's the difference between BMR and RMR? Well, these are often used interchangeably, but they are measured in slightly different ways. So BMR is measured in the morning after an overnight fast while the individual is resting in a bed. So it requires an overnight laboratory stay. So we'd wake you up early in the morning, connect you to a metabolic cart, and then we would measure the amount of carbon dioxide produced and oxygen consumed, which would then tell us what the person's BMR is. So the person does need to be free from stress. They can't be on medications or any other kind of stimulants. The room does need to be quiet. The temperature has to be controlled and free from distractions in order to get the true and absolute BMR value. As far as RMR is concerned, we do typically measure it after an overnight fast and after a period of rest, but it doesn't require an overnight laboratory stay. So the conditions that you're going to measure RMR under are going to be less stringent than with BMR. And with that said, you're only going to get a difference of about 10% between RMR and BMR. So they're pretty close as far as an absolute value is concerned, but RMR is usually going to be a little bit higher simply because of the fact that you're not controlling conditions as much. How can I determine an athlete's energy expenditure? Well, there are different techniques that are used, and you'll see some of these in the scientific literature. The first of which is direct calorimetry, and that involves measuring the amount of heat produced by an individual. In fact, the whole idea of calorimetry is measuring heat. So you actually measure the amount of heat that's produced off of someone. To do this requires a specialized chamber. And the last time I knew, there were about 6 of these in the United States. So there are not too many of them around, and for good reason. They're very expensive to build. And essentially it's just a room that is surrounded by concrete, and embedded in that concrete is some tubing filled with water. And that water will change temperature based on the interior temperature, so that ambient temperature, so the heat being given off by an individual while they're running on a treadmill is going to heat up this water, and that then is going to be measured so that you can figure out how many calories the person is expending. So the amount of heat that they produce is related to the amount of energy that they've expended. So obviously that's pretty expensive to do direct calorimetry. So we've developed indirect calorimetry, and this is basically looking at the amount of oxygen that person consumes versus the amount of carbon dioxide that they produce. And we would typically use a metabolic cart to measure these values. So I'm sure everyone's seen something that looks like this, where the person is connected to a tube that is essentially sampling the air that's being expended by the person. So you're looking at carbon dioxide content, you're looking at oxygen content, you're looking at minute ventilation, so the overall movement of air in and out of the machine. All of that's being measured and calculated, and that will spit out how many calories the person is burning while they're performing a given activity. We can also use doubly labeled water, and a lot of research studies employ this method simply because it's a pretty good method. And we're essentially giving someone a radio-labeled water dose. So we're giving them deuterium, and that deuterium then is being monitored in the urine, as well as the oxygen that's being expended through carbon dioxide. And basically the difference between these two is going to be carbon dioxide production. So if we know carbon dioxide production, then we can figure out what the oxygen consumed was at, and that will then allow us to determine the number of kilocalories that the person is expending during exercise. Now, if we don't have access to fancy equipment or are able to administer radio-labeled substances, we've got prediction equations, which is a very, very common practice. And probably the most common equation available is what's called the Harris-Benedict equation that was developed way back in 1919. And there are 2 equations here, and they're basically the same as far as how you utilize them. And you've got a bunch of constants here. So, for example, for the equation for women, if we want to figure out what the RMR is you take the constant 655.1, you're going to multiply, or excuse me, add that to the multiplication of 9.56 times their body mass in kilograms, and then you're going to add that to the multiplication of 1.85 times the person's height in centimeters, and then subtract the multiplication of 4.68 times the person's age in years, and that should give you a value for RMR. In a hospital setting, if I'm trying to figure out somebody's energy expenditure, this is basically the equation that I would use. There have been others that have been developed, and again, they're pretty similar as far as how to use them. This one is actually a little bit more simple to use. To figure out RMR, for example, in active females, you take 50.4, add that to the multiplication of 21.1 times the person's body mass in kilograms. We have this equation, again, very similar here. There's some constants, and then you're multiplying the person's lean body mass or their body mass in kilograms. Another example of an equation here that you might want to take a look at. And then the Cunningham equation. And I'm highlighting this one only because, as we'll see, this one actually was, in a research study, found to be the most closely related to the actual BMR of the person, or RMR of the person. And it's differentiated from all the other equations because you need to know what lean body mass is in kilograms. So lean body mass is the amount of muscle mass and bone weight in a person in order to use this equation. So you have to, before you use this equation, actually take some kind of measure of body composition in order to come up with a good resting metabolic rate average. The World Health Organization also has a whole slew of equations here that you can use to develop an estimation of resting metabolic rate, so both for females and males. And here's where I was mentioning earlier that this Cunningham equation actually was pretty closely related to the actual BMR value or RMR value in this particular research study for both males and females. Now, if you don't have access to body composition techniques, then the next best equation is going to be the Harris-Benedict. So I'm always impressed with that because it was developed in 1919. So we think that in our modern era, with all of this technological advances that we've got, that something that was developed in 1919 probably wouldn't have much merit in today's world. But in fact, this equation is pretty good to use as far as developing an RMR value. Now, in addition to determining the energy expenditure for BMR and the thermic effect of food, if you can't measure directly what someone's physical activity level is, you could use these PAL values that are essentially factors that you would multiply your RMR value by to get an estimation of what the person's activity level is. So the way you would use this is you would look at the column here on the left and you determine what kind of activity the person is performing. So are they bedridden? Are they performing light exercise? Are they performing heavy exercise? And then what you would do is either take the average values here in this column and multiply, let's say, for example, the person is doing light activity. You take 1.5, multiply that by the resting metabolic rate, and you would come up with the additional calories that the person would need to accommodate the light activity. There are also ranges that you could do this for. So there's a high end and a low end that you could do this for in both males and females. Now, the problem with this, as you may have guessed, is, well, what's considered very sedentary versus what's considered very heavy. And so this can be a little subjective to use. So we also want to consider the training details, the type of exercise the person's involved with, the duration of the exercise, the frequency, the intensity. These are all important factors to consider when you're trying to develop the energy requirement necessary to sustain that given activity. The time of day is also important, as well as the location. Is the person exercising in a hot and humid environment? Are they in a cold environment? Are they at altitude? Are they working out at the hottest part of the day? These are all factors that are important to consider when you're developing an estimation of the energy requirements. So we also want to consider competition details. Are they part of a team sport? What's their role in that team sport? Are they sitting on the bench most of the game? These are things that we need to know. What's the duration of the activity, the intensity, the frequency or timetable that they are performing their given task, the environmental conditions, of course the travel frequency and the requirements for travel. Are they on the road a lot? What kind of transportation are they taking? Are they spending a lot of time just sitting on the bus traveling? These are all considerations for energy expenditure. So what are the macronutrient needs of athletes? Well, this table attempts to summarize those needs very, very crudely, I might add. So as far as protein intake, about 10 to 15% of the percent of total energy needed should be coming from protein. As far as fat, less than 30% or so. And for total carbohydrate, if the person's involved in endurance sports, about 60 to 70%. If they're non-endurance sports, then greater than 65% is what's recommended. However, as we saw in the the dietary strategies to enhance cardiovascular performance are concerned, it's really better to use a per kilogram basis of carbohydrate rather than using a percentage. It's a little bit more fine-tuned to the individual, a little bit more accurate than just using a percent of total energy. So this next section was intended to be used as part of the dietary planning project. However, the food exchange system here, or the diabetic exchanges, is kind of an antiquated way to meal plan. And so it's been superseded by a few other techniques that are more modern. But I've still left this in here because it is an interesting way to look at meal planning. And so I'll just briefly go over this so that you're aware of it. But just know that it's not used heavily anymore, although you may still find it out there. Basically, this was a system that was developed by the American Diabetes Association to help individuals plan their meals. And they broke food into these 6 categories: meat, vegetables, fruit, starch and bread, milk, and fat. And what they ended up saying was that, well, within these 6 groups, which some of them have some subdivisions, for example, the meat has the very lean, medium fat, and high fat group. But basically what they tried to do was to establish what a serving size was for a particular given piece of fruit. And in that one serving size of fruit, for example, you would have 15 grams of carbohydrate, no protein, no fat, for a total of 60 kilocalories. So let me just do another example here. A very lean piece of meat, again, whatever that particular serving is for that particular piece of meat. Let's say we went with very lean, that would contain no carbohydrates, 7 kilocalories of protein, 0 to 1 kilocalories of fat, for a total of 35 kilocalories. So it attempted to quantify foods based on a serving size as far as their carbohydrate content is concerned, their protein and fat content is concerned. And so what you would do with something like this is you would determine the number of kilocalories the person would need. And so all of these numbers that you see up here were generated using the Harris-Benedict equation. So we have the REE, the resting energy expenditure, that I used the Harris-Benedict equation for. I used my PAL activity factor of 2.1 for heavy running and weight training at 8 to 10 miles per hour. And then I generalized the diet prescription for 3,500 kilocalories per day just to maintain body weight. And then my macronutrient composition, I broke it down to 60, 15, and 25% for carbohydrate, protein, and lipid, respectively. And so what you end up doing is coming up with a gram amount, and then you would utilize the diabetic exchange list, which is down here at the bottom. And you've seen this before. The previous slide had this information. I've just put it into a table here. And you would basically take the number of grams per day for each of those macronutrients, and you would try to develop the number of servings that the person needs to accommodate the number of grams of each of the carbohydrates and proteins and lipids that you would need. And so it was kind of a guesstimation. You would play around with the numbers until you got close. So you can see in this example, I got to about 3,470 calories, which got me pretty close to 3,500 kilocalories per day that I was striving for as far as my diet prescription is concerned. So once you came up with your servings from each of the categories of the diabetic exchanges, you would then develop something that looked like this to spread your meals out throughout the day. So I broke mine down into breakfast, a snack, lunch, another snack, dinner, and then another snack, and you would distribute your diabetic exchanges among various foods. So you would have all of these servings that you would have to work with, and then tell the person, well, for breakfast you can have 2 cups of milk, have 20 peanuts, an orange, 3 dates, etc. But you can already start to see some of the issues here. Number one, the diabetic exchanges, the lists of food that are in that packet basically are not comprehensive. Some of the foods actually could be considered part of several different categories, and to actually go and develop something like this and then be able to follow it is a pretty difficult and challenging task. So you can see why it's fallen out of favor with individuals, but I figure we'll just cover it so that you are aware of this. So for your dietary planning project for this class, please look on the website for the this week, and I'll explain to you exactly in some documents there how you should go about doing your dietary planning project. So don't utilize the diabetic exchanges. Use the new stuff that's listed on the website. What is energy efficiency? This was first noticed in active women who were running about 20 to 60 miles per week and who were involved in gymnastics and swimming and triathlons and dancing, all of these sports. And it was found that they were consuming less than 35 kilocalories per kilogram of body mass. And despite having a low energy intake and running energy deficits, they actually maintained their body mass over long periods of time. So what's going on here? Well, it possibly could have been due to inaccuracies in reporting energy expenditure or intake by athletes. Some of the methods that we have as far as collecting data on what people are eating, like the diet records and 3-day food record and 7-day food records, all of that information is only good information if the athlete provides good information. So basically, if you have garbage in, you're going to get garbage out as far as energy expenditure. So one of the things that you want to take a look at in these research studies is what is the method of assessing energy expenditure. Sometimes athletes don't really report accurately what they're actually doing. And as far as intake is concerned, people don't necessarily report accurately what they're consuming. The other issue here is that athletes actually might be more sedentary during non-exercising periods. And this is something that has been researched more recently, looking at what's going on during the periods where we're not exercising. Do we offset any beneficial effect of exercise with being more sedentary as far as health is concerned? There's quite a bit of work in this area, and there are some intriguing and interesting results that have been found as a result of this. We also might have an increased metabolic efficiency, so maybe the actual energy requirements are lower than the equations that have been developed. So we simply just expend fewer kilocalories rest or during physical activity than we would expect normally.